a lifetime member. She has been a member of the organization for, I believe, since 1988, which is quite a while. She is an very experienced teacher. She has been teaching the Chlorosis Elementary School project to 5th graders for a number of years. And she also teaches our intern training class about perennials and shrubs. So I just would like to turn this over to Judy and enjoy. She has so much to offer with this presentation.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining me to talk about one of my favorite subjects, starting plants from seed. So we're going to be covering several things today. First, the benefits of starting plants from seed, things to think about before you start, resources for seed starting, methods of breaking seed dormancy, the actual planting of the seeds, potting up those seedlings, troubleshooting any problems, and finally, hardening off and transplanting those seedlings into the ground. So we're going to start with the benefits. I have been growing seeds for about 30 years, and I still get excited in the middle of January when those sprouts start appearing above the soil. These young people are actually looking at caterpillars, probably from a butterfly. And the young gentleman on the right is from the Chlorosis Elementary School gardening program. He's holding some peas. This is harvest day. So most of the peas were eaten right off the vine, and we're getting ready to make green smoothies from the greens that are in our vegetable beds. This is one of the vegetable beds at Chlorosis Elementary. Hello?
You're good,
No?
Judy.
Okay. One of the beds at Chlorosis Elementary, this is our greens bed. So in this bed, we had 10 different varieties of lettuce and 4 varieties of endive and kale. And all of these plants were started by the Chlorosis Elementary School 5th graders from seed, and then they potted them up into larger containers and finally transplanted them into their garden beds. So take advantage of the large diversity of varieties of vegetables and flowers that can be grown from seed that are not available at your local nursery. Not because they don't do well here, but because, of course, space is limited. So there's such a much larger variety that can be ordered or saved from saved seed, planted again, and you can enjoy lettuce, endive, all kinds of vegetables that you would not otherwise be able to have. Saving money. Saving money is one of the best reasons to grow plants from seed. The difference between starting seeds in a medium and buying those same seedlings from a grower is huge. These are all flowers that I've grown from seed. I'm going to put my laser pointer on, which I forgot to do. So these are all grown from seed. These 3 were actually grown from saved seed. So saved seed makes it even more economical to grow plants. Stronger seedlings. There are many varieties of plants that won't bloom in a container, which is why they're not carried in the nurseries. Usually the plants that are in nurseries are things that can entice people to come in and buy them. These seedlings need a long period of time with root growth in the ground before they will bloom. So this is Larkspur. It sprouts sometime in October or November, spends the whole winter growing roots, kind of hunkers down, doesn't do a lot of growing during the winter, but in the spring, continues to grow, and about the 1st of May has these beautiful flower stalks. So this would never be available to you if you didn't grow this plant from seed. Things to think about before you start seeding. So what is a seed? A seed is an embryonic plant enclosed in a protective outer covering, a living time capsule of the plant's DNA. So everything that seed needs to sprout and grow is already contained within that seed coat. The food energy, the carbohydrates that are collected, are the storage from germination to the first true leaves. So this is a bean seed. The brown is the outer coating. And as it sprouts, the roots, of course, go into the ground. And then these are the cotyledons. And they are the part of the plant that feeds the plant, provides the carbohydrates that plant needs to grow before the roots are established. And then these two leaves are the first true leaves. So think about when you're eating beans and peas, you're actually eating the cotyledons of a plant. And those are the carbohydrates that are in that bean. The seed coat protects that seed from mechanical damage, microorganisms, and temperature and humidity fluctuations. If you are someone who likes to travel, and especially on short notice, you may want to think about the requirements of growing seeds. Usually it takes about 3 or 4 months from the time of seeding until those seedlings can be transplanted into the ground. So if you like to travel, you might want to add a house sitter to your list who is competent and reliable, because seedlings usually need to be tended at least every other day. When they're young, every day they need to be checked. Before purchasing seeds, research the germination requirements. And this is more important if you're growing seeds. Most of the plants that are available in nurseries around us have already been selected. And so we know that they will probably do well in our area. If you're ordering seeds from a catalog, it's important to research the requirements, not only to see how difficult that seed might be to start, but also what kind of soil it prefers, what the growing requirements are. And these two websites I have found to be very reliable and extremely comprehensive in the number of plants that they list. So this is one of the websites, and you can see how they list the growing information. So this is sow at 24 to 39 degrees. This means put that seed in the refrigerator or some other cool environment for 8 weeks first, then move it to a 68 degree or 70 degree area for germination. So all of the seeds that we are able to grow here are listed on one of these two websites. This is a seed envelope that I developed because I get frustrated with the lack of correct information on seed packets. Oftentimes they will give you a starting time, but most of the information is very similar to other seed packets. They don't tell you whether that seed needs light or dark, whether it does better under alternating temperatures, whether it should be covered with plastic, what kind of pre-treatment it needs, whether it needs to be scarified or refrigerated. And so this envelope, which prints on a standard 3.5 by 6.5 inch envelope, gives me all of the information that I need when I'm ready to start those seeds. I don't have to stop and go look up information in a book to find out what I need to do. Then when I get my seeds, I store the seed packet, or if I'm cleaning my seeds that I've saved, I store the actual seeds in this container. This thing keeps getting in my way. I don't know why. The effects of pH in this part of the country. So understand the effects of pH. In our part of the country, if you've grown in other areas of the United States, you may have had a soil that's quite a bit more acid than our soil. Our soil is quite alkaline. In fact, my water tests somewhere around 8.5, which is this line right here. So this is neutral. And you can see that in the neutral category, most of the macro elements are very available to plants. As we become more alkaline in soil, those nutrients start to become unavailable. So at 8.5, nitrogen is really difficult for those plants to access. Phosphorus combines with calcium at a high pH to form calcium phosphate and is no longer available in these forms to be accessed by those plants. So this is a condition that we have to deal with when we're growing plants and be aware of when we're growing plants. Not only do we have intense sun and extreme heat, but we also have very alkaline soil, which affects the way that plants are able to absorb nutrients. So this is what it looks like. This is a blue hydrangea, which should never be sold here because it's a hugely acid-loving plant. And within 3 days of alkaline water, it's turning pink. So that is what happens because the plant can no longer access those nutrients that it needs to be able to stay blue. This is a hibiscus that was in my greenhouse, and this is classic iron chlorosis. The iron is in the soil, but it's not available to this plant because of the high pH. So I lowered the pH a bit with vinegar, and you have to be very careful if you use this method. I think I used a half a teaspoon of vinegar to a gallon of water. You can certainly kill plants with too much vinegar, but look at the difference. This new growth leaf is able to now access those nutrients from the soil because of the lower pH. Nothing else changed. Appreciate our 3 growing seasons. In many parts of the country, people can grow things like lettuce and spinach in the middle of the summer. If we tried to do that here, we would probably have crispy critters because it's just too hot. All of our cool season vegetables like to be planted either in the spring or the fall, and they can actually go in quite early. It's time to put your peas in the ground right now. We can also then replant those same cool season vegetables in the fall for another harvest. So we're actually fortunate in that way. Even though we can't plant these in the summer, we actually have 2 growing seasons where we can have cool season vegetables. Our warm season vegetables do fine. We have a long growing season with a lot of heat, a lot of sunshine. And so things like tomatoes and peppers and all those things that love heat and sun do quite well. So resources, where do you find information for starting seeds? Consider a soil test. If you haven't had a soil test done on your property, you can find out a lot of really good information. Find out what your pH is, what the texture of your soil is. Do you have a salinity issue, a fertility issue? What's the composition of your soil? How much sand and clay and other kinds of components are in your soil? Organic matter, which is usually non-existent here unless you add it. What you will get back are recommendations for the appropriate amendments that are needed for your particular site. So instead of using fertilizer indiscriminately and not knowing whether your soil actually needs those extra nutrients, this gives you the information that you need to make informed choices. Online resources for vegetable and herb gardens. And this is a wonderful site, and then it's an NMSU site. Many publications at this site, from weather to insects to fruit production, vegetable production, ornamental horticulture. These are 2 of the circulars from that site, and they have just recently been updated for vegetables. It'll tell you the growing zones, recommended crop varieties, which is wonderful for us because we are limited because of our alkaline soil, our heat, our sun, to crop varieties that will produce in this area. And so this circular gives you a long list of those particular crop varieties that will do well. It also has a lot of harvesting and planting information. And this is one of the pages from one of the previous circulars. This tells you when you can put those seeds in the ground. So the black portions of this chart indicate when you can direct sow those seeds. If there's a gray portion in front of it, that tells you that you should probably start that seed indoors early. And then the black portion tells you the time that it can be placed outside. So notice that our cool season broccoli, cabbage, carrots have 2 seasons, one in the spring and then again in the fall, whereas some of the warmer season crops are right here in the middle. But this is a great chart to tell you when you can put those plants in the ground and not worry about frost too early or not being able to harvest if you plant too late.
Judy,
Yes?
for the varieties or the plants that it does not show starting plants inside, does that mean you shouldn't do that and you should plant the seeds directly in the ground?
Yes, according to this chart, yes, it means to plant the seeds directly in the ground. Now, some of these can be started. I start lettuce indoors, for instance, just because I have the time in January and I don't like thinning. And so I start my lettuce ahead of time as seedlings and then plant it out. This doesn't list that. You certainly don't have to. You can direct seed. So some of these that say direct seed, it's not that you can't plant them indoors, it's just not always necessary. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right, ornamental plants, which basically include flowers, shrubs, trees, all of those plants. So again, two great resources from NMSU. This is the Desert Blooms website, and it actually has a question and answer section where you can ask questions of our state horticulturist. And this is our Master Gardener site. There is a section at the top that says helpful gardening resources. And this site is chock full of all kinds of resources, not only the publications that I mentioned earlier, but also books. It has links to some of the associations, Native Plant Society, videos on xeriscaping, tremendous amounts of information at this website. This is a site that is put together by the Office of the State Engineer, probably because they have the funds to do it. And it's probably the most comprehensive list of plants that are adapted to our area. It was put together with the help of many of the experts who work in this area, and so the information is very reliable. You will find a picture of each plant and a limited amount of growing information. Water use is probably at the top of the list in terms because it comes from the state engineer. So they're concerned about our water use, which we should all be. So it gives you very good information on plants that do well in this area and can deal with our climate. There's a section where you can browse trees, shrubs, perennials, or you can search based on specific criteria. So where do you buy seed? Again, several different choices. Seed Savers Exchange is a nonprofit group that is dedicated to sharing seeds, primarily of heirloom plant varieties. A lot of seeds can be saved if you're growing open pollinated plants. And that's a great way, not only economically, but also to get seeds that continue to do well. Seeds adapt over a period of years to our environment. And so the more that you save those seeds and save the seeds from the best plants, that adaptation can become beneficial. Seed swaps, this is a fun one. We can't do this right now, but it's fun to get people together with seeds and swap between your friends. And then of course, seed catalogs. And there are too many to even begin to start to organize. However, there is a site that does that. So Dave's Garden Watchdog is an online site that allows users to share their opinions on the quality, price, and service. And they now have over 8,000 companies in this website. So any online source that you may be considering, but you're not quite sure, are those plants really going to be healthy? Do they have good quality seed? There are lots of people who have written about their experiences with that particular company before you have. So it's a great website for that purpose. To use it for other purposes, you need to be a little bit careful because a lot of the information is either not relevant to this area of the country, or it's information that's been posted by people who don't always have the correct information. So you just need to be cautious. But this particular one, Just Opinions, is great. The growing seasons. So Sandoval County growing seasons depend considerably upon location and elevation. So I realize that the Albuquerque International Airport is not part of Sandoval County, but it does affect our growing seasons. You can see that their average growing season is 201 days, which is very close to the slopes of Rio Rancho, 192 days. But look at Chlorosis and Bernalillo. We are almost a month less growing season than both of these locations. And the reason for that is the cold air that falls into the valley. The airport is located on a plateau, and all of the areas around it are lower in elevation. And so the cold air that comes into our area falls right off that plateau into the valley. And the same thing with Rio Rancho. The slopes are some of the mildest areas in our part of the state, because that cold air falls below that slope. These are the last spring freeze and first fall freeze, and I've highlighted the averages, but look at the difference. Earliest is the 6th of March, latest is the 7th of May. That's 2 months difference. So this is truly just an average. Every year you have to kind of look at the weather and gauge what it's going to do in the next few weeks before putting your plants out. We thought we were through the worst of the freeze last year. We hadn't had a freeze since I think about the middle of March. And then at the very end of April, we got a killing freeze. So these are the dates that you can just about guarantee there won't be any more freezes. But look at this, 7th of May for the valley. Bernalillo, June 9th, some of their later freezes. So again, watch the weather and be prepared to cover those plants that you might have put out early. So there's a 2-week difference at least between these dates, 18th of April and 3rd of May, and the same on the other side. We freeze earlier in the valley than the slopes of Rio Rancho or the areas around the international airport. So I took all of those average dates. When you get seed packets, normally they will say plant indoors 6 to 8 weeks before last frost. Or for some seeds that take a long time, plant 10 to 12 weeks before last frost. So this is kind of the window. And can you go outside this window? Yes, you can. But the further outside this window you plant, the more issues you're going to have, either with freeze or heat or some other kind of condition. So these are pretty good dates that you can count on to put your seeds in the ground or to start them early inside and know that they're going to be ready to go out at the right time.
Judy, excuse me. We have an interesting question here from someone who would like to know, how do they know which part of Rio Rancho they're in?
That's a good question. And this information, let me go back a couple slides. This information actually comes from Utah, and basically they assembled this information. And it's based on, if you go to this site, you can actually click on this link and it will give you the coordinates of where that station is located. So you'll see we have 2 different sections for Rio Rancho. One of them is warmer than the other by several days. So the locations are located when you click on these links in this website.
Oh, great. Thank you. That's very interesting.
Yes.
Good question.
And they have information from all over the United States. So you can go into the site, choose a state, and then pick the cities in that state that you want to find information about.
Judy, we have somebody that raised their hand.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be willing to take a question?
Sure.
Another one?
Sure.
Padgett, do you see him? Richard Sweeney? Padgett?
Richard, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, but please leave your video off. Yeah. Richard, you're still muted.
I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Okay. I'll lower it for you.
Okay. Okay. So given the dates that we just looked at, let me go back and see. So these are the dates for planting when you're planting after the last freeze. And that applies to some perennials, mostly to annuals. There are a whole group of plants that can go out well before the last freeze. So this is a list of cool annuals, and they basically extend the flower season on both sides. They'll start blooming earlier in the spring, and they will continue in the fall after the first freeze. So this is the Corrales Elementary School, one of the flower gardens that we have at school. And most of these things are cool annuals. We have some bulbs in here, but the rest of it is sweet peas, bachelor's buttons, dianthus, pansies. All of those flowers can be put out and will bloom sometimes before the last freeze. So at least 2 to 3 weeks before the last frost in the spring, many of these can be put outside. So germination test. So if you have old seed, and people tend to think that seed may not last very long, some seed lasts for years and years and years. So if you have a doubt about the seeds that you have, this is a quick, easy way to tell whether they're going to germinate. Put them between paper towels, wet paper towels, or coffee filters or something like that, and put that inside a plastic bag because those paper towels will dry out very quickly, I found out, and see how many seeds germinate. And this is almost 100%. I only see one seedling, and that one may be, that root may be right there. If you do this process and the roots are still small, like this one, you can actually take those seeds and put them in soil and they will continue to grow. These roots are a little bit too long to be able to do that. But you can see from this test that the germination is almost 100%. So it's a good way to tell if your old seed is still viable. Okay, requirements for germination. How do we get those seeds to sprout? So what do we need? First, we need a growing medium, something that they can grow in. We need water. Sometimes we need light, not always. We need the proper temperature, and that one's pretty important, and it's not talked about, and especially on the back of seed packets. And they also need oxygen and air circulation. So growing medium. Seedling soil, this is one that's based on sphagnum peat moss. It is sterile, has no weeds or diseases. It has perlite. This little white stuff in here is perlite, which is actually a volcanic glass that's been heated to thousands of degrees. And it also contains a little bit of vermiculite, which is mica, that's also been heated to thousands of degrees. The kids used to love the vermiculite. They thought it looked like gold, so they thought we had gold in our potting mix. And then usually they contain a wetting agent, because sphagnum peat moss is incredibly hard to get wet once it is thoroughly dried. So your mixture should be lightweight, uniform, fine texture, and the quality does definitely vary by brands. If you're looking for seedling soil, pick up the bags. If the bag is pretty heavy compared to other bags, it may contain another kind of peat moss, Colorado peat, we call that, and it's a much heavier material. It's not good for seed starting. Another media alternative is coir, and this is becoming more popular because sphagnum moss is not sustainable. It took millions of years to create the bogs that are on the border between US and Canada, and it's being harvested with huge machines at an incredibly fast pace, and when it's gone, it's gone. So this is a material that comes from the coconut husk. It's coconut fiber, and actually makes a really good starting and potting up mix. I've used it for both seedling starting and also potted seedlings up in it. The only differences that I've been able to see, it's a little bit heavier weight, and it also holds water a little bit longer. So if you're watering those seedlings, you need to be just a little bit more cautious if you're using coir. Other than that, it was a great medium. And I think it's going to be incorporated more and more into our seedling mixes because of the peat moss issue. Okay, containers. So we now have medium. We need a container to put it in. So these are several options. These two options I see often being sold in the stores around here. And while they do have some benefits, they also have some major problems. This is peat pots, and it's actually just compressed peat moss. You can plant your seeds directly in these containers, and then the idea is that you can transfer those containers directly into the ground. But there are a couple of problems with that. One is that because we do not have a very acidic soil, our soil does not break those peat moss containers down very well. And the second is that this lip can sometimes be above the soil surface when it's planted, and it will wick the water from in the soil out into the air, and you will end up with a dry seedling. And so if people use these containers, I usually recommend that they tear the bottom off and that they tear down the edges around the edge of the pot so that it doesn't wick the water away from your plant. And at that point, you might as well just take the container and take the plant out of it and put it right in the ground. It probably will be healthier. These are peat pellets, and I'm sure you've all seen them. They look kind of like marshmallows when they spring up. So you add water and they spring up, and the idea is to put your seeds in the center and they will grow. The problem is that most of the time these peat pellets are placed right next to each other. And so the roots from one seedling transfer into the other container. And when you try to pull them apart, you end up losing half of your roots in each of these peat pellets. They're also really not large enough for most plants. And the third thing is they have this plastic piece around them, this plastic netting. When it gets in the ground, then you have to go back and take all of that plastic netting off, and it's just more plastic that we don't need in our environment. These are paper pots. There's a tool that you can purchase that will make these little paper pots, and they actually work pretty well if you have enough layers of newspaper. I know that Cibola High School with their gardening program was using this method. And the disadvantage, of course, is when they get really wet, they can start disintegrating and falling apart. Other than that, they do pretty well. And this is actually the best choice on this page. These are paper towel and toilet paper rolls that have been cut into pieces about 3 inches high. The good thing is they contain the roots. You don't have to worry about the roots getting out of this container and moving into the neighbor's container. They also are open on the bottom, so there's plenty of drainage. You don't have to worry about overwatering your plants. And they hold up. They're a little bit more sturdy than the newspaper, and so they hold up during the entire process. And then you can just tear them, unroll them, and put the plant in the ground. Some more containers. Plastic containers, we've all seen these. This is a system that has a mat underneath all of these containers, and you fill the bottom tray with water, and then the water is absorbed by the mat, and then the soil picks it up by osmosis, then it goes through the pot. The problem with this is that our water contains a high number of dissolved minerals, or salts as we call them, and you can end up with that white crusty stuff on top of the surface, which is not good for your plants. So if you use this method, it's a good idea to take it out periodically and take a watering can and wash those salts back down through the soil surface and drain them out the bottom of the containers. This is an interesting container, and it would be wonderful for starting seeds since we need to recycle some of these plastic containers. It has plenty of air holes for ventilation. Hopefully it has holes on the bottom for drainage. Just don't put this one in the sunshine. In our part of the country, the sun is so intense that it will fry these little seedlings. So as long as it's in bright light, but not full sunshine, it should do fine. And then these are great containers. Let's get rid of some of these plastic containers and use them for something useful, like growing seeds. You want to make sure they're clean. If they've been used for something else, you may want to sterilize them with a 1 to 10 bleach solution. And be sure they have drainage holes. That is the most important part. Be sure they have large drainage holes in the bottom so any excess water can drain out of those containers. Okay, we have media, we have containers. Now we're going to talk about water. So seedlings need even, gentle watering to grow well. This is actually vermiculite on top of this soil, but look how fine the spray is that's watering them. No worries about these seeds moving when the spray is this fine. On this side, if a small seed, lettuce or something that has small seeds, were planted near this stick and then watered with this watering can, it would end up at the bottom of this river, which is what it is to those small seedlings. This is too high a volume and the spray is not fine enough to keep those seeds in a place where they belong. So again, very fine sprays. You need to water well. It may take longer with this fine a spray, but you don't have to worry then about the seedlings moving around. We don't have to worry about this in the valley if you're on well water, but if you're not on well water, chlorinated tap water can actually harm seedlings. So to get rid of that chlorine, you can store water in containers that are open at the top, and in about 24 hours, that chlorine will dissipate and no longer be in the water. Darkness or light. And this is something else that you often don't find on the back of a seed packet. So most seeds can germinate in darkness. They can be covered and they will germinate. But there are some seeds, lettuce being one of them, that need to germinate in light. That light actually needs to reach that seed in order for that seed to germinate and begin to grow. And of course, all seeds and seedlings need light once they sprout. But there's a real difference between seeds that need darkness to germinate and seeds that need light to actually germinate before they start growing. So light, let's continue with light. Windowsills are not a great place to start seedlings unless you have 12 to 14 hours of sun coming through that window, which is very unusual. These seedlings are desperately reaching for light. And as they reach for light, these stems become elongated. And as they become elongated, they become weak. And there's really no way to cure that. You can turn the container around and the seedlings will stand back up and reach toward the other direction. But this lengthening of the stems creates a weak plant that's not going to do well. Grow lights. There's so many choices out there now. These are the LED red and blue lights, and they can be set to encourage both foliage or flowers, depending on whether you choose red or blue. They used to be incredibly expensive. They've really come down in price. And they now have bulbs that will fit into shop fixtures that will allow you to change from that reddish color, bluish color, to grow plants. Incandescent lights are not a good choice. They're expensive to operate. They produce a lot of heat. They're not efficient. So even though it says grow light, it's not the best choice for growing plants. So fluorescent and LED lights are what most of us use when we're doing seed starting. If you're doing this is a wonderful little setup. It's only $819. And this is the deluxe version because it has LED full spectrum lights. What I found out though is there are only 2 bulbs in each of these sections, and it's a 3-shelf system. So if you're going to use fluorescent or LED bulbs, you can either use the daylight bulbs, which are about $6,500, or you can use one warm and one cool bulb in the same fixture, and that will provide the proper spectrum of light that you need for growing seeds. The lights should stay on for a minimum of 16 to 18 hours a day, and they should be placed really close to the plants, somewhere between 2 and 3 inches above the plants. Now, when I was doing research for this, I haven't read this before, but people are now saying that you can leave the lights on for 24 hours a day. That's a little outside the information that I have been receiving. And so I haven't tried it and I don't want to recommend it, but that might be a possibility. This is a Seed to Need light set. Penny Davis, who runs Seed to Need, has 3 of these frames in her house, and she starts thousands of seedlings for the Seed to Need gardens, peppers and tomatoes. And this is how she does it. So these are a set of 2 shop lights on each shelf. It has 4 shelves instead of the previous 3, and works really well for growing those seedlings. You can see how well they're doing under these lights. A timer is a wonderful thing. You don't have to get up in the morning, turn your lights on, and then remember to turn them off before you go to bed, especially if you don't stay up 18 hours a day. So a timer can be a lifesaver. And this is one of the smaller grow frames that I made for the school gardens. It's small enough that it will fit up against the wall. It's self-supporting, so we can put it any place we have an electrical outlet. It again has 2 shop lights connected to it that can be raised on these chains. It's inexpensive to build, and it can be taken down and stored when it's not being used for seed starting. It's kind of like Tinker Toys. All of these pieces come apart. So it's just made out of PVC. Temperature. So we've talked about medium, water, light, and now we're at temperature. So this is a temperature chart for vegetables. You can see the minimum range that you can put them in the ground, optimum range, and then the maximum range for germination. This is a soil thermometer, and this is one that is not digital, but they do have digital versions. You put it in the soil and it will give you the temperature of the soil so that you know when to put these seeds in the ground. And I've sorted this list just so you can see the difference between our cool crops that can actually go in the ground at 35 degrees, although I usually wait until about 50, all the way up to our warm season vegetables, excuse me, which need a much warmer soil in at least the 60 range before you can put those seeds in the ground. If you put them in too early, they will rot. If you put these seeds in 60-degree ground temperatures, they may not germinate because they do prefer these cooler temperatures.
Judy, if I use one of these soil thermometers, how deep do I put it into the ground?
Ideally, you want to put it into the ground at the depth where your seeds are going to be. So if you're planting peas, for instance, they should be about an inch, a little over an inch in the ground. So I would place the soil thermometer at that depth to see what the temperature. Now, sometimes if you're planting them on the surface of the soil, you're not going to get a good reading unless you put the soil thermometer deeper in the soil. So it works well for larger seeds to do them at that depth, but you still have to place it in the soil for smaller seeds as well.
Thank you.
Okay, seedling heat mats. These are very,
Judy,
yes.
I'm sorry, an interesting question came in
Yes.
on your last slide. What time of day would be best to take the temperature of the soil?
Good question, because if the sun's been shining it all day, it's probably going to be a different temperature than if it's first thing in the morning and the sun hasn't hit it. The truth is I would probably do it when the sun's out, and I would probably do it when the sun is not shining on it, and get some kind of average between the two.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense.
Okay, seedling heat mats. These can be used to heat the soil that you're using for germination. The seedling heat mat, the way it comes, is set at about 70 to 75 degrees. So a lot of seeds will germinate at that temperature. However, it does come with a thermostat, which will allow you to heat the soil anywhere between 40 degrees and 100 degrees. Now, if you're in a really cold area and you're trying to heat it to 100 degrees, it probably won't go that warm just because of the difference of the area. Say you're in a garage and you want 50 degrees at night and 70 degrees during the day. You could use this seedling mat to increase the temperature for the daytime or the nighttime as well. But you don't have a huge variance between the temperatures. This little probe, if you're using this soil thermometer, this thermostat, needs to actually go in the soil. If you leave it out of the soil, what you're recording is air temperature and not soil temperature. And the other thing you want to remember if you're using a seedling heat mat is not to put it on your timer because it will turn off at night. Let's see. Oh, and after your seeds germinate, even though this is, you may germinate at 70 to 80 degrees sometimes, seedlings often prefer to grow on at cooler temperatures. So oxygen and air circulation. Plants need oxygen to perform aerobic respiration. If they don't have enough oxygen, they can't grow and survive. And so oxygen is one of those important things that we don't see, but even opening doors periodically, taking the cover off periodically to get that exchange of air in your growing area is important. Fans are helpful for a couple of reasons. They circulate that air and they help to prevent things like fungal pathogens. They also are good for the stems of your plants. As your plants start to grow, you want them to have some kind of resistance. You want them to start to get used to what the wind will feel like outside. And so if a fan is blowing over a tray of seedlings, those seedlings have to respond to that flexing of their stems, and it actually makes them stronger. Okay, methods of breaking seed dormancy. And this is information that is rarely on seed packets. Even the fact that you have to use some of these processes is not usually listed. So plastic covers is one way. Most seeds will germinate well without a plastic cover. This is a tray of seedlings that I grew earlier, and you can see most of them germinated just fine without any kind of cover. However, these three needed some type of plastic covering in order to get the humidity to increase enough to get those seeds to germinate. And I found that a sandwich bag fits perfectly over a 3-inch pot, nice and snug. So I use these plastic bags for collecting my seeds in the summer and fall, and then in the spring I reuse them again for covering these seed containers. Usually when you are watering, these seed containers will stay wet. You don't have to continually take the plastic off, water them. They'll usually stay wet until the seeds germinate. Now on this one, this is a little bit too much moisture. This tray is likely to develop some kind of algae or mold growth because of the high humidity. So I would do one of two things. I would either vent this container so that some of that moisture can escape, or I would take it off and just wipe it out and let the humidity be a little bit less than what you're seeing now. This is just a little bit too much. And again, don't let sunshine shine into clear containers. After the seeds have germinated, it's important to take these plastic containers or coverings off. But you want to do that over a period of a few days so that the seedlings can acclimate to the difference in humidity in the air. Our air is pretty dry. And if they're used to all of this humidity and you just take that cover off at one time and don't do it gradually, the difference between our dry air and what they experienced in humidity is going to set them back. Scarification is another process to get seeds to germinate. You can use a file, you can use nail clippers. The object is to create a penetration in this seed that will allow water to enter, swell the seed, and break open that seed coat. Now this unfortunately is the wrong way to do it. This person is filing at the end of the seed where the embryo is and is going to damage the embryo if they go much further. Normally what I do is take a pair of nail clippers and clip right at the seam on the side of the seed. We have mistletoe and Chlorosis. In some trees, a very bad case of mistletoe. And this is an example of scarification by the birds. So the birds eat the berries that are growing on the trees, and that seed passes through their body, which is what scarifies it, and then they deposit it on another limb in another tree, and the mistletoe just continues to spread. Stratification. Stratification is another seed treatment, and many of our native plants, many perennials, need this treatment in order to germinate. It makes the seeds feel like they have experienced wintertime when they really haven't. So there are several different ways to do this. You can put them in a plastic bag, either with some medium or with paper towels or coffee filters, something that will hold that moisture. You don't want to get them too wet. You don't want to rot the seeds. You just want enough moisture that it's a moist treatment. And they need to be placed in the refrigerator for 30 days, usually, sometimes up to 3 months, depending on the type of seeds you're trying to grow. Another method, this is the method I use. I have a little small refrigerator, and I plant the seeds and then I place them in the refrigerator. So when I take them out, I can then transfer them either to the warmer temperature or to alternating temperatures to get them to germinate. And this is the result. So what happens is there are actually physiological changes that occur within the seed. All of those hormones that were keeping that seed from germinating start to dissipate, and growth hormones become increasing in that seed until it can actually germinate. I've also been able to germinate lots of seeds using alternating temperatures. So 55 at night and 75 during the day. That spread between cold and warm will oftentimes cause them to germinate as well. This is a technique called winter sowing. And if you want to know more information, this is a website that describes it very well. So you use an opaque milk carton, again, not clear because of our intense sun. Make sure to drill plenty of holes in both the top and the bottom for drainage and air circulation. You want to cut the container all the way around except for a 2-inch space that's used as a hinge. And some people put the hinge below the handle and some put it on the side. It's a matter of personal preference. I use it this way and it seems to work just fine. Fill the container with whatever medium you're using and water it in well and let it drain. Then plant your seeds in those containers, close them up, and I seal them all the way around with duct tape. And you leave them sealed with duct tape, although you leave the lid off. You notice none of these have lids, and that is so that we get plenty of air circulation inside those containers. Place them in an area where your animals are not going to get to them, wind and animals. I had about 4 containers going last year, and about 20 days after I started them, my German shepherds grabbed them by the handle and dragged them all over the yard. They thought they were having great fun spreading all that soil. So you do need to make sure your animals don't have access, and then check them periodically for sprouted seeds. After they sprout, you're able to open those containers during the day. You want to start by putting them in the shade and then gradually increase the amount of sun that they receive. If there's a huge temperature drop like the one we had a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I bring them in. The problem is if you bring them in and you leave them for too long, you've kind of disrupted the process. Mine started sprouting right away and then I had to leave them in. But the idea is to leave them outside until they sprout and grow. Now, if you have spread the seeds in the container so that there is room between the seedlings, you can actually harden them off in these containers and cut out each individual plant and put it directly in the ground. These are a little bit too close together. I would actually take these out and transplant them and then put them in the ground. And here's a list of perennials that grow in this area that need to be stratified before they will sprout. Soaking seeds is the last one of our seed treatments. And soaking seeds can speed up germination for a lot of different plants. Depending on the thickness of the seed coat, sometimes I soak them for 24 hours, sometimes I soak them for 12 hours or less. So for things like peppers, This speeds up the germination. Things like parsley. People say parsley is hard to germinate. If you soak the seed first for 24 hours, it will germinate readily. So here's a list of herbs and vegetables that do well when they are soaked, and some of the flowers that can be soaked before they are planted. And it basically just makes that seed coat able to take in more water and be ready to sprout. When you plant these seeds, these are all corn, beans, those kinds of things that are going in the ground. You want to make sure your outside soil is not soggy and that it's warm enough to plant these seeds or they will rot. So we're actually getting to planting the seeds. So I have a couple of containers, one for seedling soil, one for potting up soil. And the important thing is to get that seedling soil moist, thoroughly moist, if you're using sphagnum peat moss, before you use it to plant seeds. It's very, very difficult afterwards to get it moist. So I'm going to let the 5th graders show you how to do this. This is what they did in the springtime. Fill the container to the top with moist soil, and then water it thoroughly to level the soil. If you use a watering can and move it around on top of that soil, it will not only thoroughly wet that soil, but it will give you a flat surface on which to plant those seeds. Another alternative is to soak these containers in water. But again, if you do this repeatedly to water your plants, you need to watch out for that salt buildup that can occur on the top of the soil. And also be aware that the lower half of the container may remain wetter than the top, which is okay when the seedlings are older. It's actually beneficial to them because you don't have water on top of the surface of the soil. But it won't help you when you're trying to get the seeds to sprout. You need an evenly moist surface in order for sprouting seeds, and yet you don't want the bottom of the container to be soggy. Planting seeds. So spread the seeds evenly on top of the medium and try to space them so that they're not touching. If seeds are planted too closely together, they can become leggy or they can actually become stunted without enough room to grow. And I find that bamboo skewers work really well for moving the seeds around on the soil surface so that I can put them where I want them to be. Cover the seeds with horticultural grade vermiculite. The horticultural grade part is important because vermiculite is also used as an insulation product, and you don't want to use that vermiculite. So cover the seeds completely if they need darkness to germinate, and cover the smallest seed with a piece of cardboard. Because if you put this much vermiculite on top of a seed that's the size of dust, it's going to have a hard time germinating through the vermiculite. Cover the seeds lightly if the seeds need light to germinate. And this is oftentimes where I will use a plastic cover to keep the top of the soil moist. I have found that vermiculite absorbs some of the excess moisture that can accumulate around the seedling stems. It helps to discourage mold and damp off, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And notice that we're not putting soil on top of the seeds. All you need to do is put the vermiculite on top of the seeds. Here are a couple of other disbursement methods. For one on the left is for very small seed. You can combine that small seed with sand or something else that will fit through a salt shaker, and then use that salt shaker to spread those seeds over the top of the soil surface. This one works well. There are some larger seeds that need to be pressed into the soil, but they need light to germinate. So you can press them down into the soil, but there is a channel that's left open basically so that those seeds can have access to light to germinate. And water. After you've planted your seedlings, lightly water after planting. It gets the seeds in contact with the soil and gets the surface of the soil nice and moist. So if you have very small seeds, like poppy seeds, for instance, use a spray bottle to water them so that, again, the seeds don't move around on that soil surface. If you have larger seeds, you can use a watering can with a very fine spout.
Judy, we've
Yes.
got a question about Paralyte and Vermiculite, whether they are functionally the same thing. Are they different? Should you use one rather than the other?
Did you say perlite and vermiculite?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So perlite has a tendency, if you want a soil that will hold less water, you would want to use more perlite. It's good for things like cactus mixes and things like that. It basically takes the water and holds it without releasing it into the soil. Vermiculite is almost the opposite. Vermiculite will absorb a lot of water, but it will make the seedling mix wetter overall. So you can't really use them interchangeably. And good seedling mixes usually have some of both, up to about 15% of the total amount of medium. Did that answer the question? Yes, hopefully.
I think so, yeah. Yes, it did.
Okay. You can plant in individual containers and avoid the potting up process altogether. There are a couple of disadvantages, but there are also some advantages. So one of the advantages is it's a great way to plant seeds of larger plants with a taproot. And many of our native plants in this area have taproots. That's how they're able to access the water that's in the soil. So things such as artichokes or tomatoes that are larger plants can be planted in individual containers, put a few seeds in the container, and then take a pair of scissors and cut out all but the healthiest seedling. You don't want to let 4 or 5 seedlings grow in the pot. You need to end up with just one. So choose the healthiest one and cut it out rather than pulling it out. If you pull it out, it tends to break the roots of some of the other plants, and you don't want those roots to be disturbed. The disadvantage of this method is it takes more space. If you have a limited amount of space under lights, and if you're only growing a few seedlings, it works really well. But if you're growing hundreds of seedlings, space can be a real issue under the lights. Label your containers and label your seeds. And I, over the years, have developed using office labels instead of popsicle sticks or some other type of labeling mechanism, primarily because these get caught in the lights. If you need to have the lights 2 to 3 inches above your seedling tray, these continue to get mixed up every time you want to pull them out to water. And I tend to lose them. They fall out. I don't know where they are. I don't know what I've got planted. And so I've just gotten in the habit of labeling every single container. I also tend to move containers between flats, and this keeps me honest. Then I know what's in that container. Watering your seedlings. When you're watering seedlings, keep in mind that the containers need air as well as water. In fact, they need as much air as water. So when they're young, you can keep them evenly moist, but as they grow, let the containers dry a bit before watering them again. When you thoroughly saturate the soil, it pushes out all of the air. So you want to let them dry so that that air can get back into that soil and allow those seeds to breathe, basically. One way to determine how dry a container is, and this works a little bit better with sphagnum moss than coir because of the weight. When sphagnum moss is dry, it's very lightweight. So if you pick up the container and the container is very lightweight, you know it doesn't contain much water. If it's heavy, you know, even if the soil surface is lighter in color, that there's water in that container, enough water to support those seedlings. Fertilizer. And this is a hard one because many people think that fertilizer is the cure-all for whatever ails plants. And it's actually, in most cases, just the opposite. Seeds contain all of the nutrients that they need to grow for several weeks. they can make their own food through photosynthesis. And so you don't want to add fertilizer when they're very young. After they sprout and you get 2 to 3 sets of leaves and they've been in the same container for 6 weeks or more, you may need to add a very weak fertilizer solution to them. Now, if you're using a fertilizer that has numbers on front that say 15, 30, 15, you may want to dilute that even more. That's an incredibly potent fertilizer that will burn the roots and burn the leaves of your plants if you use it full strength. It also, that second number is phosphorus. And if you remember from our pH slide, we're putting more phosphorus into the soil to tie up more of our calcium. That calcium is needed by plants, especially tomato plants, for blossom end rot. That is the thing that tomatoes need to prevent blossom end rot. And so if we have excess phosphorus in our soil, it's tying up that calcium. So keep that in mind if you're using fertilizer. Also, synthetic fertilizer, because of the excess phosphorus, often ends up in our waterways. That's what causes the algae blooms that kill the fish and all of the other creatures that live in our ponds. So go easy on the fertilizer. This is what fertilizer burn looks like. And this is actually a relatively mild case. I've seen it where the entire leaf is surrounded in brown from fertilizer burn. The other thing is that in our soils, most of the soils in New Mexico have adequate amounts of phosphorus and potassium. What happens is it becomes unavailable because of the high pH. So putting more of that in the ground does not help. It's the same thing with iron. We have iron in the soil, it's just not available to our plants because of the high pH. Organic fertilizers are a little bit better. They contain secondary and trace nutrients. They improve the soil texture, aeration, and drainage, all of which are important. And they have slow release nutrition instead of that 15, 30, 50 all at one time. The liquid fertilizers with the high numbers on the front of the box give plants a terrific boost in that fertilizer, and it's not always a good thing. Potting up those seedlings. So seedlings are ready to pot up when the first true leaves appear. So again, these are the cotyledons. These are the parts of the plant that feed that plant until the plant can develop its own root system and start photosynthesizing its own food. This is the first true leaf, and you can see how different they look. So when you get 2 to 3 sets of, this is a dicot, has 2 cotyledons. When you get 2 sets or 4 leaves, it's time to pot these up into a larger container. Why? Why do we pot up seedlings? 1, it stimulates the feeder roots. It gives you the opportunity to select the best and healthiest seedlings. And you're putting them into fresh medium where there hopefully will be a little bit more nutrition. They can continue to grow. Now, the potting medium for potting up, basically potting soil, can be a little coarser. It can have things like bark and sticks and those kinds of things, but it's important that it's still sterile. You don't want to go out into your garden and add garden soil to it or compost, because those things may have pathogens that, although they don't hurt your larger plants in the ground, they could harm your seedlings. Removing the seedlings. And this section on the left, this is probably 300, 400 seedlings. Huge amount. Hopefully this person works for a nursery because they're going to have a lot of plants. But if you're growing plants in a tray like this, the easiest thing to do is to prick them out of the tray. Take a section out at a time to transplant. If you're growing in smaller containers, run your fingers over the top through the seedlings to protect them, and then dump the entire container. back to our 5th graders. Then carefully tease these roots apart. Keep the extra seedlings covered with moist soil if you're not working with them right away. And choose the seedlings with the best root system and healthiest growth. If you have 2 seedlings and you're making a decision which one to keep the one with the best root system. The foliage on top can grow again. If you tear off half of the roots in the process, the plant has a much harder time recovering. And when you're transplanting, hold those seedlings by the leaf. If you should happen to tear off a leaf, the plant is still alive and can regenerate more leaves. If you hold them by the stem and break the stem, then that one goes in the compost pile. So again, there are kind of 2 methods for putting seedlings into containers. One I want to call the pour method, the other is kind of the drop method. And it depends on the size of the root system. If the root system is fairly large, it's easier to hold the seedling over an open container and pour the soil in around it and then gently firm it around that seedling. However, if you have very small seedlings that you're transplanting with not very much of a root system, it's easier to make an indentation in your container, drop those seedlings in, and just kind of firm the soil around it. So it depends partly on what's more comfortable for you and partly on the size of the root system. When you get the seedlings in the containers, and if you're using a container that is divided like these plastic containers, you want to make sure that all of the soil in those containers is at the same height. If you have one section that's lower than these other sections, when you water, that water will drain down into that little section, constantly keeping that seedling wet, and it will not do well. You also don't want to cover the cotyledons. We've talked a lot about the cotyledons. They're the first leaves that come up from the soil. You want to keep those, if they're still on the plant, you want to keep those above the soil level. Now, sometimes when the cotyledons are growing, they will often fall off of the plant when their work is done. So if those cotyledons fall off, that's not a problem. That's a normal process of growing the seedlings. And then water them in well, allowing the water to settle the soil. And this is what it looks like when they're potted up. So we usually give these seedlings a day or so to recuperate in low light, and then put them back under the lights, or in my case, I start taking them out. Troubleshooting seed starting problems. So these are both caused by overwater. This is algae growing on the surface of the soil that's been in sunlight. And so it's nice and green, and you can still grow plants. They will still grow with algae on the surface of the soil, but it's not ideal. In this situation, if you have soil that looks like this, just toss it and start over. This is so much mold on here that this is not going to produce a healthy seedling. So these kinds of things are caused by too much water, over-fertilization, poor air circulation, or insufficient drainage. You've heard me talk about put those holes in the bottom of the container, get that water moving out of there. And this is why. This is a disease that is caused by fungi, and it is incredibly contagious. If it starts in your seedlings, you want to immediately remove those containers away from the rest of your seedlings. You will sometimes see this, and sometimes this will be below the soil line level. But you will notice that your seedling doesn't look good. Sometimes the stem is kind of mushy. Sometimes they will kind of flop over looking like they need water, but they don't. They have this disease, and this restriction right here keeps any kind of nutrients or water from getting into this stem. So again, there's no cure. If you have this, the best thing you can do is get those seedlings away from the other seedlings. How do you prevent this? Sterilize your equipment. If you need to use a 10% bleach solution, that will sterilize your pots or whatever else you're using for your seedlings. use sterile potting medium, provide good drainage, use warm water and avoid overwatering, use a heat mat for seedlings that prefer high temperatures, don't fertilize until the seedling has several sets of true leaves, and control fungus gnats. If you have fungus gnats on the top of your containers, that in itself is an indication of overwatering. Hardening off. Okay, our seedlings are doing well. We now need them to get ready to go outside. And in this part of the country, that can be a challenge. This picture is interesting. This person said they put the seedlings out for 1 hour trying to harden them off, and a hailstorm came up. So all of this white that you see in here is hail. Didn't do much good for these poor seedlings. So when you do put them out, a cover is nice. If you can put them under a portal or something like that, that's always a good thing to do. So why do we harden off? Hardening off gradually exposes those seedlings to the sun, heat, and wind. And again, we have some of the most intense sun toward the summer of any location in the United States, actually in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's extremely important to harden our plants off. What's happening is plants have both an epidermis and a cuticle. Epidermis is like their skin, and the cuticle is on top of that epidermis. It's actually a waxy covering that protects that seedling, something like sunscreen does with us. And so as you gradually increase the amount of sun that these seedlings receive, that cuticle grows thicker and thicker until it can tolerate full sun, if the plant itself can tolerate full sun. You have to allow more time for this process as the sun gets higher and hotter. So now we might be able to harden off in a week. As it gets to the end of May, it's going to take a couple of weeks to go through this process. It's just too hot and too much sun for the plants to absorb all at once. And this, by the way, this same process should be used with any plants that you purchase that are undercover. This is one of my pet peeves with big box stores and plants, because they will often put all kinds of plants out on a table outside the building with no cover whatsoever. And I walk by and those plants are flat on the table and nobody's picking up a hose to water them. They may pick up a hose later in the day, and those plants may recover or look like they've recovered the following day, but the damage has been done. Okay, locate microclimates around your house that will protect your seedlings and provide that gradual increase in sun and wind necessary to acclimate the seedlings. So I do it the hard way. I have different spaces around my house that I know how long the sun is going to be there, put them there, and then I have to move them to another location to increase the amount of sun, etc. When it gets a little warmer, I'll put them all in one of my beds and put a shade cover over it, and then I won't have to move them as much. So this again just describes the procedure. 1 to 2 weeks before transplanting, move them outside. Begin with the shade, leaving them in the shade when it's not windy, and probably 45 to 50 degrees is probably the lowest temperature that you want to start. And then increasingly for longer periods of time, up to no more than 4 hours of morning sun. And as we get into the warmer part of the year, 4 hours is going to be too much. So you need to keep an eye on your seedlings. Also remember that the shade moves and the wind can be variable between 1 hour and the next. Here's an easier way to do it. This is a cold frame on the left, and you can put your seedlings in the cold frame. You do need to remember to open this as soon as the sun comes up in the morning and then close it when the sun goes down in the evening. Or you can get an automatic opener. And this opener will work with windows up to about 15 pounds. This is wax inside this black tube. And as the sun heats the wax, it expands and causes the window to open. And then the reverse happens in the evening. The sun goes down, this wax contracts and closes the window. So it's a wonderful way not to have to be out there first thing in the morning and then again in the evening. More automatic. And this is the way Penny from Seed to Need does it. She has thousands of seeds that have to be seedlings that have to be hardened off. And so she makes a frame with straw bales. And then this is a wood structure only to hold this row cover. So this row cover keeps insects and other things from getting into the straw bale area and eating these seedlings, but it also provides a little bit of cover from the sun, a little bit of shade from the sun. And then she has a larger blanket, a heavier blanket that can go over this if the temperatures really start to drop. So if you have many, many seedlings to harden off, or if you just like to harden off a small amount of seedlings and make a frame, this is a great way to do it. Wilting. When you're hardening off seedlings, you need to be on the lookout for plants that are wilting. So wilting for short periods of time is relatively harmless. And as you're hardening off plants, sometimes you want them to be a little bit stressed and wilt slightly. However, prolonged or severe wilting is extremely harmful for plants. The plants I was talking about at the big box stores, they look like they've recovered the following morning, but the truth is that the damage has been done in terms of that plant. It won't show up, however, for probably another week to 2 weeks. And this is why I think they don't take it very seriously. But several things can happen. At the worst, the plant can die. If it doesn't die, it will probably lose some of the lower leaves after they turn yellow because of the stress, because basically the plant is shutting down its vascular system. It can't support the entire plant when it's wilting. And so it has to make choices. And so it will either sacrifice some of the lower leaves on the plant, or it may shed flowers or immature fruit that was starting to grow on the plant, because it's survival. It's a survival mechanism. It's getting rid of anything that it doesn't have to support at that time. And plants can be permanently stunted. So if you're buying plants at big box stores, don't buy the ones that are out on the table. Go inside and pick out the ones that are underneath the tables and haven't been severely wilted. First aid for wilted plants. Now this is only for plants that are wilted because of lack of water. Plants can also wilt from disease. They can wilt from overwater. They can wilt from too much fertilizer. So there are other things that will cause wilting, and this is not the solution for those plants. So if your plants are hardening off and they're starting to wilt, the first thing you want to do is move them into the shade. And then you want to take a spray bottle and mist the leaves. If the container is dry, soak that container in water. But if the container is already wet, don't add more water to that container, because it won't cure the problem. What's happening is the plant is transpiring moisture out of its leaves faster than it can take it up through the roots. And that's what causes that plant to wilt. So if you pour more water into that container, those roots can't take it up any faster than they already are. And prepare your area for transplanting. So install your irrigation, test it, make sure everything is working properly before you put your plants in the ground. Amend the soil if necessary, and then water the planting area well before you transplant. If you water just the individual plants that you're putting in the ground, and the ground around those plants is dry, it will wick the moisture away from the plant that you just planted. So make sure your soil is moist when you put the plants in the ground. Choose a cloudy or rainy day, which is kind of a joke here because we don't have that many. Or the other thing you can do is plant in the evening to allow the seedlings to recover before the following day. Now, this is, again, more important the hotter the temperatures become and the more sun that we have. This time of year, you can get away with planting lettuce or those kinds of things in the middle of the day, and it probably, if you've hardened your plants off well, and it won't affect them, excuse me. But if it's the middle of May and the temperatures are climbing into the high 80s or 90s, you want to be sure you give them some cover, let them recover over the night. When you put your plants in the ground, dig a hole as deep as the root ball, except for tomatoes, which are grown deeper. Loosen the soil 2 to 3 times as wide as the root ball. Now, if you have sandy soil, your soil is already loose, so you don't need to do that particular step. And then I form a cone of soil underneath the root ball in the hole so that it will prevent air pockets from forming underneath the roots. Put all the soil back into the hole and place the seedling at the same level that it was growing in the pot. You don't want to plant, except for tomatoes, deeper or higher than it was growing in the pot. Replace the soil and water well. And then mulch. Again, due to the heat and intensity of our sun, it can fry those roots that are close to the surface of the soil. So this is an organic mulch that you can put around plants. You can also use gravel. If you have native plants or plants that will tolerate reflected heat, this is a perfect mulch. The top may be very hot, but if you reach down underneath this gravel or rock, you'll find that the soil underneath is moist and cool. So either one of these mulches, depending on the kind of plants that you're growing and your landscape, both of these will work to protect your plants. It will help moderate the soil temperature and help keep those roots from getting too hot from that intense sun. And I always throw a little shade over them if I'm putting them in the hotter part of the year. And you can use so many different things for shade. You can use an old umbrella, a piece of shade cloth on any kind of support. These are a couple of screens that block off just enough sun to give these plants a chance to get going. Even though you've hardened them off, you're now putting them out in the soil for up to 12 hours of sun a day. When you hear these plants will grow in full sun, they don't mean full sun in New Mexico. They mean about 6 hours of full sun, which is what many people in the country have. We have much more sun than we need. And so shade is something that really helps our plants in this part of the country. And that is it. Thank you very much. Enjoy the journey of growing plants from seed.
Judy, thank you very much. That was great. Now we're going to take a little time for some questions and